As the 24th Division threw itself in front of the steamrolling North Korean Army, Marine Commandant Clifton B. Cates prepared to send in his Marines. Stationed at Camp Pendleton was a provisional Marine brigade that could ship out immediately and arrive in Korea within a month's time. On July 3rd, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade set sail. Numbering approximately 6,000 men, the brigade consisted of several infantry battalions, field artillery, and support units. A Marine air group of fighter bombers was also attached to provide air support. In command was Brigadier General Edward Craig. Craig had served with the Marine Corps since 1917 and was a highly respected veteran of both World Wars. On August 2, 1950, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade arrived in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula at Busan, the only part of South Korea not overrun by communist forces. Here it joined the hard-pressed U.S. 8th Army, which was desperately defending the Busan perimeter against superior North Korean forces. Almost immediately upon landing, the brigade was thrown into battle in an attempt to stop several dangerous North Korean breakthroughs, which threatened to drive the 8th Army into the sea. Despite its raw, untested condition, with many of its troops only partially trained and many strangers to one another, the Marines rose to the occasion. By July 1950, the ROK Army had suffered over 70,000 casualties and now only controlled a small section of Korea. The U.S. Army had lost almost 6,000 soldiers who'd been fed piecemeal into the meat grinder that was the war in Korea. In addition to the heavy combat losses, U.S. forces faced an equally troubling crisis: discipline. Many times during July, American soldiers had retreated instead of engaging the enemy.
The 1st Marine Brigade came in and put them down in the southwest corner down there, and they were a little better trained. And the Marines have that attitude that we are the greatest, and therefore they have to live up to their reputation. So they were better fighters at that particular time. The 24th Division and 25th Division was having some trouble with the discipline, morale, training, so that they were getting pushed around.
Soon after the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade arrived at Busan, General Craig addressed his troops by saying, "It has been necessary for troops now fighting in Korea to pull back at times. But I am stating now that no unit of this brigade will retreat except on orders from an authority higher than the 1st Marine Brigade. You will never receive an order to retreat from me. All I ask is that you fight as Marines have always fought." They would not disappoint their commander. The first real threat to Busan came from the 6th North Korean Division. These veterans of the Chinese Civil War had made rapid, if circuitous, advance through southwestern Korea and were now threatening to outflank Walker's line in the south. The 25th U.S. Division barely held them less than 30 miles from Busan. The North Korean commander Kim Shea-tia tried to exploit this breach in the First Battle of the Naktong Bulge. He hoped to preempt further UN reinforcements, but by August 24th, the attacks here and at Daegu had been thrown back. The effort to dislodge UN forces from their last toehold in Korea had cost the communists dearly. Of the 90,000 soldiers that streamed across the 38th parallel on July 25th, only 70,000 remained. Despite having a numerical advantage, UN forces were still in danger as they found themselves under siege from all sides. The last major natural barrier that stood between UN forces and disaster was the Naktong River. Spanning over 326 miles and passing through Pusan, the Naktong River ran up the perimeter's western side. Over the next few weeks, American and South Korean soldiers would fight valiantly to prevent the communists from crossing Korea's longest river. At first, General Walker had only 5 South Korean and 3 American divisions to defend the Naktong. This left the American general with too few men to form a continuous line of defense. Walker decided to do the only thing he could under the circumstances: attack. Walker ordered the newly arrived Marines to join up with Army units to take part in the first UN counterattack of the war. The attacking force became Task Force Keene. Reinforcements were now arriving daily. Better American bazookas and heavy M26 Pershing tanks had arrived and could take on the T-34s. On August 3, 1950, General Craig's 1st Provisional Brigade disembarked at Pusan and moved into the perimeter, where poorly equipped ROK units, backed by the 24th Army Division, had been fighting against heavy odds. Within hours, Marine F-4U-4 Corsair pilots from VMF 214, the old Black Sheep Squadron, flew off the USS Sicily and scored the first Yak kills.
We had what they call the Pusan perimeter. And it was a little piece of property that was about in a little rectangular shaped piece of property in the corner of Korea. And it was, the whole perimeter was about 120 miles, a little over 60 miles north and then west, east, just that forming that little box there.
There were now 141,000 UN troops inside the perimeter's boundaries, even though only 92,000 of these were combat soldiers. General Craig's 1st Provisional Brigade's first encounter with the North Korean enemy came on August 7, 1950. After taking over a defensive position near the vital railroad junction at Chindong-ni, Craig felt vulnerable and decided to redeploy his men. In the pre-dawn hours, the young Marines were hit by the North Koreans, who directed the main force of their attack on the old American positions. In heavy fighting, even the Marines showed signs of being green during that first night of action. But they soon learned. After stopping the enemy thrust, the Marines counterattacked and, in temperatures over 100 degrees, captured a key NKPA hill position. During the next few days, the entire brigade, supported by Marine Corsairs, tore into the enemy. In savage fighting, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade blunted a number of enemy attacks and drove them 30 miles beyond the perimeter, capturing the NKPA headquarters at Chinju. In the process, they inflicted heavy casualties on the North Koreans, although suffering heavily themselves. Impressed by the brigade's fighting spirit and effectiveness, over the next few weeks, Walker employed it as a fire brigade, along with several Army units, such as the 27th Infantry Regiment. They rushed from hotspot to hotspot, counterattacking and sealing off threatening enemy penetrations. In this role, the Marines again performed admirably. On August 12th, as the brigade pushed towards Sekhan, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines received an urgent call to plug a gap 25 miles away, where 2,000 enemy troops had infiltrated the perimeter and overrun 2 Army artillery battalions. Helicopters delivered the 3rd Battalion to the site, and the infiltration ended in disaster for the Communists. After leaving Chinwon, Craig's men joined up with Army units to form Task Force Keene. General Walker created Task Force Keene to spearhead the UN's first large-scale counterattack of the war. Comprising this task force was the 25th Infantry Division, with the 24th and 35th Infantry Regiments, the 5th Regimental Combat Team and the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade were attached to the 25th. Their plan called for a three-pronged attack that would hopefully drive KPA forces from the region. As Task Force Keene headed west towards Chinju, the North Korean 6th Division was attacking eastward towards Maesen. Suddenly, the soldiers of the task force found themselves under attack from all sides. Amidst the confusion and intense heat, an army unit stationed on top of Hill 342 was surrounded by KPA forces and placed under siege. Hill 342 was of particular importance to Task Force Keene because it overlooked their main supply route. Earlier that day, the American soldiers were ordered to hold Hill 342 at all costs. However, as the sun set, it seemed like only a matter of time before the hill would fall into North Korean hands. At midnight, Craig's Marines were ordered to break up the siege before it was too late. With the help of artillery and air support, Craig and his men managed to reach Hill 342's crest early the next morning. It had been a difficult journey for the Marines as they were forced to climb Hill 342's steep slopes in temperatures that would exceed 112 degrees as the day progressed. As the Marines tried to catch their breath, the North Korean force began advancing up the hill. Despite losing many soldiers to heat exhaustion, KPA units steadily fought their way up the hill and reached Marine lines. Intense fighting broke out as the American soldiers tried desperately to hold on to Hill 342. While things looked grim for the Marines, Craig had an ace up his sleeve. Stationed on board the light carrier Baedongyang Strait were Marine Corsairs capable of providing close air support. Craig's men marked their positions with panels and then radioed in for help. Soon thereafter, the Corsairs roared overhead, blanketing the hillside with machine gun fire. For the first time in the Korean War, KPA soldiers were forced to retreat. Hill 342 was saved, but the fighting continued as Task Force Keene drove the North Koreans back. However, the drive stalled after the 555th Field Artillery Battalion was decimated by the Communists. At the same time, North Korean forces launched attacks at several other points along the Pusan perimeter. General Walker was forced to dissolve Task Force Keene and send Craig's Marines to help overrun army units around the perimeter. The Fire Brigade's first mission was to stabilize Chindong-ni. Relying on helicopters to reach their objective quickly, Craig's Marines managed to restore the lines quickly. This victory would prove short-lived as the Pusan perimeter soon faced its most potent threat. 75 miles north of Chindong-ni, KPA soldiers had managed to cross the Naktong River and were heading towards Miryang. If Miryang fell, the Communists would soon have a clear path to Taegwa, the home of South Korea's provisional government. The Pusan perimeter and the entire Korean War were on the line as Craig's Marines boarded trains and traveled towards Miryang. At 1 minute after midnight, with soft pops, red and yellow flares shot up and glowed briefly and eerily in the warm night. To the 800 men of the 3rd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment of the North Korean People's Army, this was the signal to begin crossing the Naktong River near the Aang ferry site. The troops carried no heavy weapons or mortars. After crossing, they formed up quietly in a column of platoons and moved stealthily through a draw leading into the American lines. Their objective was the town of Yongsan, about 8 miles behind the lines of the U.S. 24th Infantry Division. The UN troops in their path were unable to stop them. They could not even slow them down. Although the U.S. 24th Division's situation was grim, prisoners reported that the opposing division was also in poor condition, low on ammunition and supplies, and hurting in morale. Hurting or not, the enemy continued their attack on August 16th, while on the United Nations side, both the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps were preparing for a new attack of their own on the 17th. The Communist soldiers soon came to an area known as the Nak Thong Bulge and captured the region's dominant feature, a long, barren ridge called Abong Ni. American Marines came to know it as No Name Ridge. From the top of Abong Ni, the Communist soldiers were in a position to topple Pusan's southern perimeter and possibly drive UN forces into the sea. Realizing this danger, General Walker quickly sent reinforcements to No Name Ridge, and on the morning of August 17th, Craig's Leathernecks arrived from Myang. Craig's 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, consisting of the 5th Marine Regiment, supported by a 105mm howitzer battalion from the 11th Marines, and a tank company, prepared to strike back. The Marines also had their own air support, the 1st Marine Air Wing's gull-winged Vought F-4U-5 Corsair fighters. With Abong Ni Ridge ranked as objective number 1, the plan of attack for August 17th called for the Marines to go first, with the Army's 9th Infantry providing supporting fire from Hill 125. The Marines then would support the 9th when it launched its own attack on the ridge west of Tugoke. The attack began with the U.S. artillery pounding Abong Ni for 5 minutes, followed by Marine Corsairs dropping bombs and rockets and raining machine gun fire from the sky. Unfortunately, the Marine preparatory artillery fire fell beyond the objective for the most part and was ineffective. The planned airstrike was so late the Corsairs had time for just one pass at Abong Ni before the infantry moved out. The North Koreans were well dug in and barely touched by the preliminary bombardment. The Communists held their fire until the Marines had advanced halfway up Abong Ni's slopes before opening up with everything they had. Caught in the crossfire of enemy machine guns and with almost no cover, the Marines took heavy casualties. After losing 60% of their strength, the assault force was left with no choice but to fall back. Making matters worse for the American soldiers around Abong Ni was the arrival of 4 enemy T-34 tanks under the cover of darkness. These Soviet-built tanks headed directly toward the Marines' lines, supported by North Korean infantry. They wreaked havoc on South Koreans and Americans alike. As the 4 North Korean tanks rumbled forward, it seemed that their victory at No Name Ridge was in sight, or so they thought. Over the past month, UN forces had acquired several weapons capable of destroying the big Russian-made tanks. Craig utilized all of them. First, he sent his M26 Pershing tanks into battle, firing 90mm high-explosive shells and armor-piercing rounds. At the same time, Marine Corsairs provided support from the sky and set one tank ablaze. The Marines trapped on Abong Ni's slopes then opened fire with 75mm recoilless rifles and 3.5-inch rocket launchers. In less than 5 minutes, all 4 tanks were burning. But the battle was far from over. That same night, North Korea's 4th Division launched another assault on the Marine positions. Following a blanket of mortar fire, the KPA soldiers rushed the Marines, hoping to drive them from the ridge. The fighting was intense and in several places hand-to-hand. That night, many positions changed hands several times in the darkness as fighting carried into the next morning. On the morning of the 18th, the Marines continued their attack along Abong Ni, and by 9 a.m., they had taken hills 117 and 143. The enemy was in retreat in full view to the hills beyond. Before morning's end, all of Abong Ni was in Marine hands, but A and B companies now totaled only 216 men, about half their original combined strength. Once Abangi Ridge had been taken, artillery, mortar, and tank fire blasted away. Corsairs dove to the attack, and the enemy retreat became a rout. While the Marines cleared the North Koreans from the ridge and nearby Hill 207, the Army's 19th and 34 regiments still struggled. But by noon on August 18th, they too had taken their objectives, Hills 240 and 223, and sent masses of enemy soldiers fleeing toward the river. Late in that afternoon, Marine and Army attacks resumed. The Marines supported by an awesome array of mortars, artillery, recoilless rifles, and tanks. By the end of August 18th, most of the North Korean bridgehead had been eliminated with a fearful slaughter of the enemy. On the 19th, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines launched the final assault. At 8:45 a.m., the Marines and the 34th Infantry linked up with one another. The price had been high. The Americans had lost 137 killed, 763 wounded, 564 missing, and at least 161 non-battle casualties. Of the total, Marine casualties were 66 killed, 278 wounded, and 1 missing. The North Korean 4th Division that opposed them was virtually obliterated, suffering 4,000 casualties. Despite these heavy losses, fight for control of No Name Ridge was not over. After spending nearly 2 months on the defensive, General MacArthur was preparing for his first major offensive of the war. In June, MacArthur had pointed at Incheon on a map of Korea and said, "If I had a Marine division, I'd land them here and trap the KPA between a hammer and an anvil." Lemuel Shepard had promised him this full division by September, and General Cates scrambled to fulfill it. Over 83,000 Marine reserves were called into active duty by President Truman, and every available Marine was transferred into the 1st Marine Division from Camp Lejeune. The newly reactivated 1st Marines sailed for Korea on August 15th. Leading them into combat was Louis Chesty Puller. One of the most highly decorated Marines in Corps history, Chesty Puller had given up a position as CO of the Pearl Harbor Marine Barracks to return to active duty. North Korean commanders knew that they would not be able to match UN strength after reinforcements arrived. Their only hope of victory was to defeat the South Koreans before they could fully deploy. The North Koreans planned one last desperate offensive to break through the Pusan perimeter. Repeating their earlier strategy, KPA forces launched simultaneous attacks around the perimeter on September 3rd. Communist soldiers streamed into the Nakton Bulge once more, and Craig's Marines were once again called upon to defend it. The fighting was intense as KPA infantry, well supported by T-34 tanks, tried desperately to defeat Craig's Marines. Once again, they would fail. Even without the benefit of Marine Corsairs, U.S. forces managed to overcome the Soviet-built tanks with a combination of anti-tank weaponry and their own tank fire. As the final KPA soldiers were pushed back across the Naktong River, the threat to Pusan went with them. Since their arrival in Korea, Craig's 1st Provisional Marine Brigade had suffered 900 casualties but inflicted over 10,000. MacArthur now wanted Craig's brigade for the Incheon landing, and on September 5th, the 2nd Army Division relieved the Marines. The 1st Provisional Brigade marched back to Pusan, heads held high, and joined the 1st Marine Division. Craig's tactics added a new chapter to modern warfare. For the first time, air and ground elements worked in concert under one commander, and for the first time in a war, the Marines used helicopters in combat. The UN forces stationed inside the Pusan perimeter had weathered the North Korean storm, and now it was their turn to unleash a tidal wave at Incheon.